Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Let's Talk Homeschool podcast. I'm Rachael Carman, and today I have a very special guest with me, Jennifer Pepito, who has written a new book, Habits for a Sacred Home. And we're going to chat about that in just a minute. Jennifer, you and I met a few years ago in a couple of different locations. I think one was at a homeschool conference, and then in another instant, you and I shared the stage and we're encouraging moms, which I think is the thing that you and I love to do. Could you just tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, those were really fun moments, Rachel, especially the Awakening Moms conference that
Yeah.
Brian Dixon put on. I think that was in Charlotte. That was really fun. But I am the mom of seven children. I just love, love, love being a mom. I've been homeschooling for 27 years. And about 9 years ago, I started creating literature-based homeschool resources for families. So I've been like you, deep in the homeschool world for a long time and just so passionate about really, you know, creating schools for the service of the Lord, creating
Mm,
homes that are full of Jesus, really.
yeah. Yeah. I love your heart. I think that's one of the things that drew me to you. We've had some good conversations. Tell me the age range of your children.
Yeah, my oldest is 31 and my youngest is 16. So
Wow.
I have some poetry. There's some poetry rolling around in my head about that because, moms in the early years are often like, I'll never be alone. I'll never get a minute to myself. And I'm in a season of feeling like, oh my gosh, like I don't want to be by myself. I miss reading out loud. I did read out loud to
Mhm.
my teens. It was last night I read out loud to my teens for a little bit because they're 18 and 16, the last two,
Yeah.
and they have their own classes and their own lives. But oh, those years of morning time with my babies was just glory. And I'm so thankful I got to do that.
I totally agree with you. We've been in the empty nest now for I think a couple of years. And, when they were all younger, you think that day's never going to come. And then it comes and the silence echoes. Silence echoes. And I totally agree with you. Those years of snuggling on the sofa, I was just telling Davis today, I was reading an article and I was just like, oh, those days where I would circle the sofa while they played and I read to them and we would drink tea. And those were glorious days. And I am so, so grateful for those memories, as you are, I'm sure. So, Jennifer,
Absolutely. Yeah.
I have had the privilege the last 4 years, we're starting our fifth year of mentoring a mom's group. Um, I'm betting that we had similar experiences when you were a young homeschool mom. Can you talk a little bit about your experience? How did you get encouragement as a young homeschool mom? Were you part of the support group era that is kind of faded into the background, unfortunately now? What did you do during those early days?
Yeah, I did have book clubs and co-ops, which were a huge
Mm,
encouragement to me. I went to my first Charlotte Mason homeschool co-op when my oldest, I think, was 3 years old.
wow.
And we studied the Charlotte Mason Companion at that time. So those those evenings of being with other moms and being able to talk together about what we were learning and what we were doing were such a comfort to me. And I still have those kinds of support groups. Over the summer, I led a 6 week study on habits of a sacred home,
Hmm.
and then I have this little group. We plan a yearly conference together. And so we're often also trading recipes or sending each other lists of the books we're reading or memes, So
Yeah.
it's obviously changed a little bit how we interact from the earlier days where it was just a phone call or an in person meetup. I wasn't really online much in the early days. So I wasn't involved in a lot of, Yahoo groups or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. I just remember those just being sanity for me, being able to look forward to going and talking in full sentences with other humans. That meant so much to me back in those days. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity now, like you, to be able to help and mentor other young women. And I've got to tell you, I am just so excited about your book. I am elated, overcome with excitement about your book because this mentor group that I do, these young moms that come over and they talk about what a blessing our time is together. They bless me just listening to their stories and laughing with them and praying with them and studying God's word with them. So when I saw your book, I don't even remember where I saw it, Jennifer, true confession. But when I saw your book, I knew that I wanted to get this to share with the moms in my group. You want to tell me about the genesis? Where did this come from, Jennifer? Where'd you get this idea?
Yeah, well, we both spoke at this conference called Awakening Moms or Awakening Moms, something like that. And it was a little bit about, what was going on in the schools. It wasn't directly a homeschool moms conference, but we were just sort of like pointing out to people, I mean, don't just sit back and let chaos and a culture that's anti-God overcome your families. And in that same season, when we spoke at that conference, I also read the book, The Benedict Option by Rod Dreher.
Yeah.
And he talked about how Saint Benedict, back in the Dark Ages, when chaos was reigning and the world was falling apart, he set up this like the monasteries and a rule of life. And in so doing, many people credit the monastic movement with saving civilization.
Yes.
And I just started thinking about how, oh my gosh, like we homeschool moms, we are like a monastic movement and we are saving civilization as we read aloud to our children, as we grow a garden, as we pass our sourdough starter around. Like all of these things are very civilization saving practices. And
Hmm.
we are doing it as homeschool moms. And so the message is really just such a powerful message that while we cannot control the outcome of our children, like they are the clay in the potter's hand and we are not the potter, we can recognize that the work we're doing is powerful, transformative work, that we are just like the saints of old who, copied down scripture, passed on the word of God to their people, and created a remnant.
Yeah, I'm just everything you're saying. I just want to say amen, 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 amen. You're exactly right. And it's so easy, I think, as moms at home with littles, especially, to feel like what we're doing doesn't matter. And that's what I love about this book and just listening to you talk about it. I love your heart saying, but it does matter. All those things matter. They matter and they echo across eternity, right? They really do matter. And I love that. And I love the Benedictine thread you pull through the whole book. That's beautiful too, because Rod Dreher's book is, I think, a must read. And I think in tandem with this book would be really, really powerful. But the idea that we are doing that in our homes, I love that picture. That's very inspiring. So, do you want to walk through it with me? You want to walk through the book for with me and go through these habits and see what we can uncover to tease people out with the picking up their own copy? You start here in the
Yeah, for sure.
beginning, the need. You want to talk any more about that? I think we've established it, but is there anything else you wanted to
Yeah,
say
and
about?
one thing I do want to say is I think sometimes like for for people like myself who value say pro-life, or
Mm-hmm.
we value a more conservative government that's not like spending money willy-nilly, or we
Yeah,
value perhaps not starting wars in other countries that we have nothing to do with. So people
yeah.
like ourselves, we might be right now feeling like, oh, sigh of relief, there's a different administration and there's not going to be as much like sort of the anti-God policies. But really, if we aren't a virtuous country, it doesn't matter the administration. We're still going to act in unvirtuous ways. And
Mm-hmm.
and some of that is even just like the attitudes of greed. Like I will, and I don't want to like pick on people who use charter schools, but charter schools, it's a government funded school. It's an awesome opportunity. My son's in one this year, but they like pour out money at the families. They throw money at the families. And I don't know what it's like in your state, because California especially has them. My sister-in-law said she has like $18,000 to spend on her kids this year
Wow.
from the church school. And so she was like,
Wow.
she bought like a shofar, like it was like her musical instrument. And my sister-in-law is a very like a minimalist, not a greedy person at all. But it is interesting how, we as like, how, we're in, this is why America is not a democracy, because democracy is basically mob rule. So if you get a group of people who are maybe more conservative, but we're still greedy about our own stuff, we're still going to
Mm-hmm.
have bad government if
Yeah.
we don't have like the golden rule, or
Mm-hmm.
even the 10 commandments active in an active life. And so habits for a sacred home is really about cultivating virtue in your home. It's not about
Mm.
being perfect. Sacred
Right.
doesn't mean perfect. It means
No.
consecrate. Because I think sometimes people
Mm-hmm.
get intimidated by that and they think, oh, my kids are on social media or we made all these mistakes as parents and then they don't even want to read it. But it's
Yeah.
not about perfection. It's about consecration. Like I
Yes.
have made every mistake in the book as a mom. I have failed in so many ways, but what I get points for is faithfulness. Like I am hanging on to
Mm,
Jesus and I'm not letting go. And I
right.
think that is who in the end will win. And it says that it says, run with endurance the race set before you. Look to Jesus, the author and
Yes.
finisher of our faith. And so, that's really the premise of the book is that, okay, we live in a hard time in society and culture. A lot of people do not value virtue. A lot of
Right.
people, do not have an allegiance to God and a shared value system. But
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't mean that we can't continue living virtuous lives and cultivating virtue in ourselves first, but then
Mm-hmm.
also in our homes. So
Yeah.
there are 9 different people that I feature in the book
Yeah.
who lived virtuous lives, and that was one of my favorite parts too. Rachel, is being able to feature some of these like heroes of the faith who also were my support group in a sense in my early
Exactly.
days of
Yeah.
mothering. Reading books about these women when I was a
Mm-hmm.
young mom helped me live a little more like we were missionaries. I read about Sabina Wormbrand. My
Mm-hmm.
husband, had to travel for work. I read about Ruth Bell Graham. Like some of these women really strengthened my faith and my resilience in my early mothering years. But a lot of the moms now don't even know who they are because
Mm.
we live in such a like recent culture time in history. Do you know what I mean? Where
I do
people
know. Yeah.
only know about whoever the famous influencer is.
Right. No, I think you're exactly right. And I love how you introduce this next generation to these women because along with you, these are some of my heroes. I love the women that you chose, although I will confess there were one or two that I'm like, hey, I missed somebody. And I was so glad that you had them in here for me to learn about. I love also what you were just saying about the definition of sacred because, we are in a war right now for the definition of words. And I really appreciate that you unpack that sacred means consecrated, set apart for God's use, doesn't mean perfect, right? And that's really important because I think the idea of perfection keeps us from starting some really good things and some really necessary things in our home, like the ones that you've laid out here. And if we thought for a moment that we had to carry out these 9 things to perfection, you're right, none of us would open the book. But that's not what you're advocating for here. And I love that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I have a community group. Last year we went through the restoration through Habits for a Sacred Home in our restoration home community. This year we're doing For the Family's Sake by Susan Schaefer McCauley. But one of our mottos is 1% improvement. Because
Mm,
when you're in the early years of motherhood, when you have infants and toddlers, it can often feel like you are making zero improvements. You know what I
yeah.
mean? It's not a
Hmm.
time where you necessarily feel a lot of authority over the way your day goes. You
Yeah.
just have to be so responsive to the needs of those little children.
Yeah.
But still, if 1% improvement, you put down your phone and look your baby in the eyes.
Yeah.
1% improvement means you get the dishes done before you go to bed that night. Like just the
Yeah.
little baby steps in those early years, it builds
It
to
does.
greater habits. Like I was able to write books. I'm working on my third book right now because in the early years I made small choices of how to use my time and how to
Hmm.
how to sort of steward my time or
Yep.
some good habits to instill in my children that now mean that I can put time into other things that I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise.
Exactly. And I do think getting the message out and inspiring women in that way, because it does seem like sometimes we live in an all or nothing culture, right? That we have to do it all or we have to do nothing. And when what we do, we have to do perfect. And I really appreciate that you're emphasizing that because I think that's just so important in this culture that it's not about perfection. I even heard a phrase the other day that I really loved, and that's the idea of when you fail, fail forward, at least fail forward. Like you learn something, you pick yourself back up and you go forward and you don't get stuck going backwards in your failure. So I think that's really important. I think it goes right along with what you're suggesting here in the book. So let's look at habit number 1, a habit of work. Edith Schaefer. Talk to me. What do you
Yeah,
love about Edith? She's amazing. Where to begin?
Yeah, so amazing. The Hidden Art of Homemaking was one of those early books I read as a mom. Obviously, so many of us have been shaped by her daughter's books for the
Hmm.
family's sake and for the children's sake. And Edith was not in her mind a hero. Like, I don't think she thought that much about what she was doing. She was a very hardworking person, hosting all of these people in her home, living a little bit on the edge financially, like from month to month. They weren't necessarily sure where they were going to live at times or what God would provide. And yet, just, very steady and cheerful and diligent. It's
Hmm.
interesting because they did have a child who was rebellious as an adult and wrote mean things about them,
Hmm.
kind of fell away from the faith after he had been an integral part of their ministry. But at when Edith died, he, wrote an obituary saying that your joy and your faithfulness has won me over. And so
Wow.
I loved that picture of just sort of faithfulness in
Hmm.
spite of difficulties. And there was no claims of perfection. Like, I think sometimes some of the other, heroes in the book, most especially Elizabeth Elliot, can be so um so like strong and so persevering that it's hard to relate. But
Hmm.
Edith, she didn't put up a lot of like, I am so perfect, look at me. It was just more sharing her ideas and sharing really important thoughts that we should be passing on to our children and our loved ones.
Yeah, I marked here. I love the idea of rhythm. That's something that I've latched onto. I think in the early days of my homeschooling, well, I don't think I know, I latched onto schedule and I loved my schedule. I loved having it down to the minute what we were going to be doing, right? And it was just, that's a no win for anyone, right? But this idea of rhythm, that's a winner. And I like what you talked about here about the idea of pray and work. Because I could just imagine the Benedictines pray and work, pray and work, pray and work. You talk about a doable thing, praying and working. That's very
Yeah,
doable.
and for young moms, I think sometimes it can feel like that's all we do is work.
Yeah,
But I
it's
love
true.
there's a book by Ronald Rolheiser, Domestic Monastery, and he talks about how a mom at home with her young children, taking care of a baby, changing a diaper, even that can be a way of praying. And I think, for
Mm,
me, there was a lot of prayers uttered while I was working, a lot of prayers while I was driving a child to a co-op class or while I was doing the dishes, sometimes while I was walking a child across the night in the middle of
hmm.
across the floor in the middle of the night, trying to get them to sleep. A lot of
Yeah.
prayers were uttered at those moments. So yeah, I love that theme that they had of ora et labora, but also for us, sometimes it's simultaneously praying and working.
Yes, I think that's another one of the themes that I feel like through the whole book is a redeeming of these ideas because I think too often we think of work as means I get dressed and I go to an office, right? But reclaiming and valuing the diaper changing that happens at home, that's work. If ever there was work, changing all those poopy diapers, that's work. Setting up a household, doing the groceries, making the meals, reading to the children, discipline. I was thinking when you were talking about prayer, I had a lot of prayer time when I was in the role of referee between he said, she said, right? They're pointing at each other, just praying to the Lord for discernment. So, yeah, there's a lot of opportunities to pray as young moms.
Yeah, and I think too, it's just also reframing work because so
Hmm.
often we do think of work as being this thing that penalizes us. We think of
Yes.
the work of caring for our homes as something that is victimizing us. And then it creates a lot of bitterness. And our children hear us talking. Like, they're not
Hmm.
oblivious to our attitudes. And if we're constantly complaining to our friends about, oh my gosh, I have to change another diaper. Oh my gosh, they threw up today. Like, they're just so hard to take care of. Like, if we're constantly complaining about
Hmm.
our kids in front of them, what are we communicating to them? But when
Exactly.
we look at the work of caring for our families and our homes as this like beautiful opportunity to steward a treasure, it totally
Exactly.
changes our perspective and the way we feel. Like, we can actually transform our emotions to be more productive. And this last year I actually did a sort of like a part-time ministry school program, and
Hmm.
there were so many single women there who would have loved to have my life, like who would love to be a mother, who would love to be a wife,
Mhm.
and so many lonely people in the world. And
Mhm.
as homeschool moms, we have people who love us. And so just changing the way that we, especially the way we talk and think about those people. But
Agreed.
then if we change the way we talk and think about them, it's also going to change our behaviors and our actions.
Exactly. And that order matters, right? You can't just fake your actions. You have to go all the way back to how you're thinking. And I think that's really powerful. And you've already stepped into number two, talking about stewarding. Talk to me about a definition of steward. I don't think that that's a word. I love that word. I want to bring back some of these old words. Talk to me what it means to steward your home.
Yeah, and I loved what Saint Benedict said is he said even the most humble of tools, the shovel, the kitchen appliance is sacred,
Yes.
is a tool for the service of the Lord. And what a
Yes.
beautiful way of sort of switching your mindset around your belongings, because I think that we so often are all about accumulating more instead of thinking about how can I take care of the things that I have? Like, do I
Mm,
even have the margin to take care of what I have? Or
yes.
should I focus on stewarding the books we have, the clothes we have, the kitchen appliances before I acquire more? And that was really the emphasis of that.
Yeah, I think taking care of our things. I still remember my grandmother darning socks. And I think that that is like a lost art. We just replace them at Target instead of maybe just sewing the whole clothes, right? We just don't, we've
Yeah,
lost some of those old skills of stewardship and resourcefulness that in bygone generations they were forced to master. And what if we were to bring those
right.
back, look at things differently?
Yeah,
In
yeah. And
in
so many of those heroes really exemplified that. I think that chapter was about Ella Tweeton, but Sabina Wurmbrand, I talked about simplicity with her. So many of those, a lot of them lived around the turn of, around the world wars, around the turn of
Mhm.
the century. There just wasn't the same kind of plethora of stuff that we have now. And so simplification or stewardship might have looked a little bit different, but it's still an essential for us today, because if we can even stewarding our physical health or stewarding our attention span. I'm writing a newsletter today about stewarding our attention span because it's so easy
Mhm.
to be kind of loosey goosey about how we spend our mental energy and actually be sabotaging ourselves in that way too.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. There's a lot we could unpack there. Amy Carmichael, you bring up Amy, and she is one of my heroes of the faith. Her whole ministry continues to just astound me. Her focus on serving the poorest of the poor and how dedicated she literally gave her whole life. And the last years of her life were a trial, but she remained focused even then. And prayer was a key component of her ministry. How do we make our homes homes of prayer?
Yeah. I loved writing about her. And while I was writing about her, I actually wrote to her ministry, which is still going today, Donover, and
Wow.
they still have regular times of prayer. In
Mm.
most, like in culture, you look at like in the monastic movement, I think they stop like 6 times a day for prayer. There's many devotionals that are like morning and evening prayer.
Hmm.
And so I think Christians historically paused a few times a day to pray. And for us, as homeschool moms, homeschool families, a lot of this, like I said, is just as we go about our days. But I think part of what we're trying to cultivate here in sacred homes is homes where we are attuned to God and we
Mm.
are, giving him our attention. So that does also require, sometimes doing it as a community act. Like for me with my
Mhm.
children, we will often say the Lord's Prayer at night, or we'll recite the Apostles' Creed before we go to bed. Just like these moments that are kind of set apart to
Mhm.
incorporate prayer. And I loved, Amy Carmichael at the end of that chapter. I quote her saying, we must not just, we are in a fight,
Mhm.
and it's a serious battle,
Yes,
and
it
we
is.
cannot be casual about this. And
Mhm.
she says we must not only pray but also listen. It's just such a
Mm.
beautiful in exhortation to us as moms that yeah, she says the fight to which we've been called is not an easy fight, we're touching the very center of the devil's power and kingdom, and he hates us intensely and fights hard against us. We have no chance of winning unless we are disciplined soldiers, utterly out and out, uncompromising, and men and women of prayer. So first, give much time to quietness. We have to get our help, for the most part, direct from our God. And I especially love that because, in our homeschool lives today, it is very hard to cultivate quietness, especially
Mm,
with phones, because even if it's not our children talking to us, it's an audiobook or a podcast. We are
yeah.
just flooded with information. And
Yeah.
your podcast, my podcast, they're great. You should listen to them. But we also have to, at times, have a little bit of quietness so that we can,
Mm-hmm.
be attuned to God. And it's like I'm reading some of the philosophy of education by Charlotte Mason. She's talking about how ideas come to us. Like she's quoting Coleridge, but just that God gives people innovative ideas.
Mm-hmm.
The next great idea that could, help end homelessness or could help break some of the worldwide problems we have could come to one of our students. But if we're not cultivating any kind of quietness in our homes, they'll never hear. It'll never be able to occur to them. Like really good homeschooling requires making time for quietness. And so not
Mm.
only do we have to model that as mothers,
Yes.
we also have to, make sure we're carving that out for our children. And that takes a lot of self-control because there are so many opportunities to get information in and not
Mm-hmm.
as much to just be quiet and let things simmer a little bit, which is one reason why, our family prioritizes taking hikes in nature, things like that, where
Mm-hmm.
you're moving, you can't really be on a screen while you're doing that.
Yep.
And it gives you a chance to listen.
Yeah. And you really can tune in to what he has to say to you. I went through a spiritual renewal course a few years ago, and we had to choose and commit to setting aside periods of loneliness, of silence, like you're suggesting. And when the assignment was first made, I was like, this won't be a problem. I actually love the silence, right? This is not a problem. And then as I stepped into the assignment and started realizing how much I had coming in when I was driving, like listening to another podcast or listening to even Christian radio or Christian music, even that. And so I decided I was going to like not listen to anything when I was driving in the car and just listen to him. It was an absolute game changer. It seemed like a really small thing that it wasn't going to make a difference. It made all the difference. And I think you're right. Just pulling back and finding what is one way that we can choose silence over the noise. I think we can underestimate what a big difference that can make. I love that idea. That's great.
Yeah, so wise.
Elizabeth Elliot is next, and you're right. She looms large. I mean, she just seems just perfection from head to toe, right? And yet I think she would be the first one to say that wasn't true.
Yeah, and reading her there was a series of books that just came out by Ellen
Mm-hmm.
Vaughn about her.
Yep.
I really appreciated those. It only actually raised my estimation of her in a way because
Mm-hmm.
because of her personal beliefs, and I'm not saying she did the right thing. I'm not making any kind of call like that if you're in a
Right.
situation like this, but from what it said, she was actually in an abusive relationship. The husband was very controlling and she realized right
Yes.
away that she'd made a mistake, but
Mm-hmm.
she just had such a high priority on on keeping her word,
Yeah.
on her convictions that she stayed in that relationship. And I'm not making a judgment call on whether it was right or wrong, but definitely as far as a woman of grit
Mm-hmm.
and just a high degree of you know faithfulness,
Right.
she does loom large. But in that chapter, I was just talking about order because in a way it's become a dirty word
It
in culture.
has.
Do you know what I mean? Like there's such a movement even in among Christian homeschool families to sort of not give their children any leadership, to really just sort of let them um raise themselves in a sense. And yet
Mm-hmm.
in my own experience, because I did experiment with that, there's actually a lot of insecurity that comes up for children when nobody's in charge. It creates a lot of feelings of fear and just kind of it's too much pressure.
Yeah,
And
I
so
agree.
I really believe as moms that we have to just sort of get a new vision for what authority looks like. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe it requires forgiving our parents or forgiving our husbands if either one of them were authorities or even pastors. Like I think there's been so
Mm-hmm.
many core authority figures in our lives that we're just wary of any kind of authority structure. But
Right.
I think that is actually, an assignment from the devil to create chaos in culture, because anything, any real big advancements in culture takes leadership. It
Mm-hmm.
takes some people setting a vision and some people making that vision happen.
Yeah.
And if you look at like the great exploits of old, I mean, the Ernest Shackleton endurance
Yeah.
expeditions, one comes to mind. They would all have died if everyone was just making their own plans. They had to
Mm-hmm.
work together as a team. And, if you, I mean, I've talked to a few different people in both private, public, Montessori schools. Teachers can't teach anymore because most of the time is given over to classroom management. And that's
Mm.
partly because at home in the early years, nobody's telling the kids what to do. And it's a
Yes.
disservice to our children when we have no order.
I think you're exactly right. And this move of this called gentle parenting. It's always called something that sounds glorious and good, right? But it's actually this what you're describing as nobody's really in charge and you're always asking permission from your children. I agree. I think establishing order is something that is worth advocating for and pursuing because your kids really need that. It does give them security. And I actually
Right.
think
And
that
and I,
go ahead.
yeah, I'm a big believer in, respecting the child. That's one of Charlotte Mason's
Indeed.
basic principles as well. And understanding our children, being responsive. And I think that,
Hmm.
maybe there was a bad name because of some old school teachers who, really didn't have a lot of like maybe even child development insight. And so they were
Hmm.
laying down these laws on parents. And then it's a certain level of immaturity. Like if you want to apply like, oh, my child, I'm going to only feed them every certain hour so they'll sleep at night. Like that's a little bit of immaturity to dogmatically apply something like that instead of knowing your child and asking
Hmm.
God for wisdom about how to take care of that child.
Yes.
And we've all been there as parents. I was
Hmm.
there as well, an immature young parent and making mistakes. But I think, we have to be careful about like listening hard to any leader because they
Hmm.
swing all over the place. And then
Yeah.
you find out, oh, this person who tells me that I'm going to grow my kids God's way, half their kids don't even speak to them. And
Right.
so just
Yeah.
being discerning
Hmm.
and growing in maturity and growing in just relationship with God so that you can be led by the Holy Spirit instead of
Hmm.
being a slave to some leader.
Exactly. Some, yeah, formula, we could call it.
Hmm.
We've already touched on simplicity. I love how these all overlay on each other because they are completely interconnected and woven through this whole book. But this idea of simplicity has gained some popularity over the last few years. What does it mean to have a home of simplicity? What does it mean to interject that into our everyday lives?
Yeah, it's definitely one of my favorite. Those chapters on simplicity and stewardship are favorites for me. I, I've probably always been a little bit of a minimalist because
Hmm.
I love being out in nature, and so that lends itself to being a little
Hmm.
bit more careful about how much I consume. And then also I love being with my kids, and the more we have in our homes, the more time is spent organizing that stuff. And as much as I am, somewhat of a minimalist, I still have, drawers that are chaotic and multiple of the same kind of like lip balm or whatever. But I think that just looking at some of these people in history and the joy they had despite the lack of stuff can give us a
Mm.
vision for saying, what do we really need? Like, what is really going to enhance our lives if maybe if I don't shop online as much, or maybe if I don't spend as much time scrolling and ending up, needing to buy those new chicken pajamas or whatever comes through our feed. Um, that's what came through mine last night.
That is so
So
funny.
I
Chicken
think just
pajamas.
yes, and they were so cute. I would have wanted to buy them on the spot, but expensive. So, so just being a little bit more aware and thoughtful about, hey, what do I actually need, and how much time is this taking? In the Restoration Home community, we actually do a time audit when we
Mm.
start the year because I think sometimes we don't realize how much time is being spent on organizing stuff, buying stuff, putting away stuff. Like, how much time do we take every day opening Amazon packages and putting this stuff away? Like
Yeah.
it can end up taking too much time that could be spent connecting to our children, connecting to God on eternal pursuits. And so just being mindful of that as mothers, I think is so important.
Yeah, it's just another distraction, right? It's just another way to keep us off task. And you make the comment, we end up leaving no space for intentionality. That's a powerful line.
Yeah.
Just the thought that we're just doing all these other things, organizing, unpacking, repacking, that we're not having time to be intentional about other things. That is so
Yeah,
true.
to really, yeah, to have a vision for our lives or our families, or it's just like you said, I think they're distractions, and it's not a bad thing unless it's out of order.
Right. And that order thing, again, these just all complement each other. That's just the perfection of, I mean, I love this book. I'm sold. I think this is so exciting. Habit of stability. I was a preacher's kid growing up and I moved around. Stability was not part of my experience. I think we counted one time and I had more addresses than I was old when I was 23. So
Yeah.
stability was not something I had in terms of an address, like Ruth Graham talks about in here. But I had stability. I knew my parents loved Jesus, and I knew my mom
Yeah.
and dad loved each other, and I knew we were going
Yeah.
to be a family. And that goes a long way when you don't have the other, like address stability.
Yeah, I think that's really good that you brought that up, because I also moved a lot as a child. We didn't necessarily have, and there was a lot of other ways we didn't have stability either. Like we went through some times of being very impoverished as a family.
Mm.
My mother was often very afraid during my
Mm.
childhood, and so it takes a toll on us as people, and can
Hmm.
sort of create and nurture those same kinds of sentiments. But I really loved just looking at Ruth Bell Graham and how she was so steady. It would have been easy to be really up and down, her husband
Hmm.
here and gone, and her son in trouble and then not in trouble. Like, it would have been easy to be emotionally very up and down. And she also, she grew up as a missionary kid in China. So she too experienced that instability of moving around, and during, I think that there was a lot of unrest in the country when she was there as a missionary kid.
Hmm.
But in her life, I think she was just so anchored into Jesus. And that was one quote that I found about her later. Because I talk a lot about writing your eulogy
Hmm.
as homeschool mom, and then kind of working backwards from there. And her
Hmm.
eulogy that her daughter wrote about her kind of said that she was just so had so much peace and
Hmm.
joy, and she could tell that she'd anchored into Jesus so tightly that the winds of life couldn't really shake her.
Yeah. She did an amazing job. I've read several different biographies on her. Biography and autobiography is like my favorite genre. And it's remarkable to me the haven she created for him. I mean, I don't remember, you may remember, I don't remember how many days of every year he was not even home. And she was literally home with five kids. Was it five kids, I think?
Yes, yeah, yeah, 5 kids, yeah,
And I just think, sometimes Davis couldn't get home soon enough from the office after leaving at 8 a.m. So, I mean, we're talking days on end she's at home with these five kids and her ability
yeah.
to create that haven. What are some things that you could suggest to young moms? I think many of these young moms today, even if they have a vision for homeschooling their kids, they don't have a vision for what it means to create a haven at their home. What would you say to that? How do you do that? How do you create that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it's our attitudes, because
Mm-hmm.
it's so much more. I think generally our husbands are actually working really hard to please us. Like,
Mm,
generally they
yeah.
want us to be happy. And when we are consistently unhappy, it can be very hard that, they
Yeah.
will maybe give up even.
Sure.
And, I quoted Wendell Berry in this chapter, because he had these like 10 commandments for making a life,
Mm-hmm.
that he's make a home, make a community, be loyal, put the interests of community first, love your neighbors, um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, find work that does no damage. So these little simple things that Wendell Berry talked about. But then Ruth Bell Graham, you just saw her kind of doing what needed to be done every day, and really in every writing about her and others talking about her, there was a lot of joy. Like, her oldest daughter Gigi says not once did my mother make us feel that by staying behind, she was sacrificing her life for us
Mm,
children. By her sweet, positive example, her consistently unselfish spirit, and her total reliance upon the person of Jesus Christ, we were kept from becoming bitter or resentful. So I think creating a haven comes much more down to your own attitude than
mm,
something that you do. It's nice to light candles. It's nice to, cook, to like make a meal plan and throw some stuff in the instant pot so that you have dinner ready for your husband. But I think so much more of the haven atmosphere
mm,
is just our own joy and peace. And there's a book
mhm,
called Four Habits of Joy Filled People that I highly
mm.
recommend. It's like a simple little book that just highlights, if you struggle with being regulated, with being calm, with being staying in joy, a book like that might be a great place to start.
Yeah, but I love that's exactly what I was hoping you would say is it's not about having your house all perfectly decorated or perfectly clean or having the perfect candles lit or the music going. It's literally it's an inside out thing. It's what you radiate, that joy, that attitude. Then
Absolutely.
I'm going to I'm going to put hospitality and community together. I love hospitality. That, if I had to pick the strength of the book, that would be the one that I love to do the most. But the habit of hospitality is something I think we really are out of the habit of. Too many times we do, well, even at our church, we do the showers at the building instead of somebody's home. And there's something far more powerful about doing those get-togethers in someone's home, right? How do we, if you've never
Yeah.
had people in your house, what fear do you think keeps us from practicing hospitality?
Yeah, I think it's often just shame. Like we don't think we're going to do it
Mm,
good enough. We're afraid they'll judge us. And actually, it was Ella Tweeton who I used for that example of hospitality, because she was a poor pastor's wife. The book written by her daughter called First We Have Coffee is a
mm-hmm,
beautiful book to read if you are a young homeschool mom and you're trying to get a vision for home. Like they didn't have much in terms of resources. According to her daughter, her husband was not that great of a provider or a husband. But this woman, she just radiated so much love to her family and her community, opened the doors and invited people in despite the lack of belongings. And then for community, so that was hospitality. And then community, I featured actually a Jewish woman, because that's the other thing I think for Christians who are in more like non-denominational or anything, a lot of Christian culture does not have a lot of shared values that are clear and descriptive. I
mm,
think that we were sort of, and I think that's part of why there is this big movement towards, becoming Orthodox or Catholic
mm.
for Protestants,
Yep.
because they're almost looking for more direction. They're like,
Yes.
okay, well, we sing and we worship, but how should we then live? You know what I mean? I think
Right.
there's a lot of confusion, especially in a culture that's so off the rails.
Mm-hmm.
Like it used to be maybe more culturally, there was a sense of what is right and wrong, and it was sort of defined by biblical ethics, but we don't even
Mm-hmm.
have that anymore. I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people are, excuse me, a little tired of being confused about
Yes.
what is right and wrong. And so they're looking for slightly more top heavy systems of leadership. And that's what they had
Mm-hmm.
in the Jewish community, is
Yep.
a very clear, you absolutely Sabbath. And they still do that. We
Mm-hmm.
were in
Yep.
Israel over a feast weekend, and they did not go on their phones. Like we went into a hotel and the hotel was kind of messy that day, but there were
Wow.
whole families sitting around in the lobby, just sitting there talking together. Nobody was on their
Mm,
phones. You just don't even see like families hanging out together without screens hardly anywhere
ever.
anymore,
Yeah, it's
and
very
so
true.
um yeah, so that there's still like among the Amish, among the Jewish community. And I know that there's a lot that you could say about legalism and things like that, but just being aware that we do need to have some kind of shared values or some kind of like ideals, and we have a community, and I describe them in the book, who everybody really loves Jesus and everybody's really trying, and we're not all the same. Like we don't all act it out the same way, and we're very honest with each other about our struggles, but there's definitely an intentionality in this whole community to care for our homes, care for our
Mm,
children, love our husbands, love our communities. And so we do inspire each other to good works in a sense. And I think
mm-hmm.
it is really important for everybody to have that. And part of the joy of the Restoration Home community is that every month we have these habits of virtue that we're working on together so that we're not left hanging and unaware, unsure of what it looks like to live a virtuous life. We're actually working towards it 1% at a time.
I love that. I do love that. And I think part of what you're saying in this book is we really need each other to cultivate these sacred homes. You're not calling for us to do this individually. You're calling us to create these sacred homes within a community of other people pursuing the same ideal. And that's what's so
Yeah,
beautiful.
absolutely.
You round out the book with the idea of balance, which just seems to be that elusive thing we're all trying to do. How do we pursue balance in all the positives without getting stuck in that we can never get that actually achieved?
Yeah, and I think it's so important because I feel like a lot of what's happening in culture, and I think it's shifting now towards Reformation, but I
Hmm.
think what's happened in the last, 10, 20 years has been a reaction to the 80s and 90s, maybe even early 2000s. Like there was a movement after the Jesus people movement, people
Hmm.
got saved. They're like, we don't want to live this crazy life anymore. So they started listening to the Dobsons and like more Christian parenting, but there was
Hmm.
a lot of legalism and performance injected
Hmm.
into that. And so then I think it left the next generation like at loose ends because they're like,
Yeah.
I don't want to be like my parents who, they were mean at home or they were the
Mm.
biggest hypocrites ever. And they made us all dress up nice for church every Sunday. Or, there was like not really connection in the family, but a lot
Hmm.
of behavior modification. And
Hmm.
people have reacted against that. And that's
Hmm.
how it is. But I think there's a movement back towards having more Christian values, maybe, or better behavior, even just a little more courtesy,
Hmm.
because we're seeing what happens when there's no, we have children coming to school thinking they are an animal. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In previous times in history, somebody would have said, "Hey, you're a beautiful little boy or girl. You're not an animal."
Hmm.
The
Yeah.
culture would have pushed back against that, but we
Hmm.
don't have that right now. So there has to be some culture pushing back, but we also have to have that balance so we don't keep swinging the pendulum. Because
Hmm.
if we're not doing things, for one thing, led by the Holy Spirit, for another, out of love instead of out
Hmm.
of shame or swinging of the pendulum or whatever it is, we're going to still make a big mess. And
Hmm.
so I think it's so important to just look at our actions. I mean, for one thing, do it unto the Lord yourself and don't always be picking on other people. Like that's one thing I love about my
Yeah.
community now. We do see the faults in each other. It's not like we are oblivious to ways that our friends are in process. But we also love each other enough to stay in community, and when appropriate, call each other up to something higher, but
Hmm.
not, there's no rejection or like, I'm better than you kind of an attitude. I think that was where, maybe movements like ATI or whatever went
Hmm.
off the rails, is there was such a lack of grace
Hmm.
and even hopefulness. I
Yeah.
just talked to someone the other day who they were, and I'm sure you know what ATI is, and probably a lot of people listening don't,
Yeah.
but they
Yeah.
were they were involved, and they had a child with who'd come out of the foster care system, was really struggling behaviorally, and they told them to send her back because she was a bad influence. And I'm not saying that that might not at some point be what a family has to do, but also where's the hope and where's the teaching on
Mm.
like um connection and eye
Hmm.
contact, and where's the like support systems that will actually come alongside your family and
Right.
help support you in a trial like that. I think there's a lot that we can do better in this,
Hmm.
in the reformation that I believe is coming,
Yeah.
in terms of, not judging each other so harshly on behavior, but having a little more hope and faith for what God can do, even in the midst of mess. Because you look at some of these heroes, many of them did have children who struggled. Some of them might have actually struggled. Sabina Wurmbrand wasn't always a perfect Christian, but in their lives, they made a huge impact for good. But
Hmm.
part of that involved forgiving themselves, forgiving others, and not, walking in shame about the mistakes that they did make.
Exactly. And that's what the enemy wants us to do, right? He wants to captivate us with that shame and that guilt and make us convince us that we're a lost cause, right? I love the phrase you used. I'm going to use this. I'm going to take this from you. I will try to remember to give you credit. I love the idea of you know that you and your friends are in process. That's really beautiful. Not even that you're even thinking you're going to ever achieve perfection, because Jesus Christ was the only ever perfect one, right? We're in process in this transformational process of becoming like him, which means we all have warts and mistakes and things, and yet we need each other. We need each other. We need each other to be honest. We need each other to be encouraging. And I think what this book does is it gives us an opportunity to be part of the change that we want so much to see in the world. I love your vision of the us. It begins with us in our homes. It begins with us as moms in our homes, as husbands and wives. It begins with those read aloud times and that order that we set and opening our doors and welcoming other people in. Jennifer, I'm so glad that you wrote this book. I really think that this is going to be a blessing to so many. Is there anything else you'd like to say about it as we wrap up our time together? I could talk a lot longer, but I think we need to wrap it up.
Oh, I'm just so grateful for the chance that we had to chat about it. And thanks so much for the opportunity, Rachel.
Where can people find you, Jennifer, online?
Yeah, if you go to thepeacefulpress.com, you can find links to my book and podcast and the community I mentioned. And that's just a quick, easy way to get to know us better.
Okay. Well, thank you again for being here today, and thank you for writing this book. And I look forward to digging even deeper into it. And I think that we will have another conversation on the other side of this year with my moms to give you some feedback, because I'm sure that we are really going to be blessed by this. May God bless your ministry. And thank you,
Oh, God
everyone
bless you,
else.
Rachel.
Thanks so much. And everyone else, thanks for tuning in today. We'll see you next time.